Chair recognizes the honourable member for Golden Isles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a brief contribution to the Juries Amendment Bill and the Parliamentary Elections Bill that is before us. And I do so following a very impassioned and obviously genuine and heartfelt contribution from the honourable member from Tall Pines, who has expressed a lot of the frustrations being experienced by many in our country today. Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the people of the Golden Isles constituency, who I am privileged to represent in this House at this time. And I would just like to report to them on the progress of some of our initiatives in the constituency. The repairs to the boat ramp have been completed in Adelaide Village.
You'll be brief, the honourable member.
I'm sorry?
You'll be brief?
Very brief, sir. Very, as is my custom. And so that is in use now, the ramp for the fishermen in the area. The work on the clinic for Adelaide Village is set to commence very soon, and the same for the water infrastructure in Coral Lakes and in Boatswain Hill. I, too, very briefly, Mr. Speaker, would just like to associate myself with the comments made by other members in congratulating Trinity Methodist Church. The representatives have since left on their 150th anniversary, and as well to extend congratulations to the softball and the swim teams that were here present earlier today. Mr. Speaker, these two amendments, the amendments to the Juries Bill and the amendments to the Parliamentary Elections Bill, are related, and in short, they enable the parliamentary registrar to collect information inclusive of the phone number, the email address, fax number, and NIB number of persons being registered to vote. And it additionally empowers the registrar, the parliamentary commissioner, to share that information with the registrar of the Supreme Court pursuant to directives of the Chief Justice. The amendments, Mr. Speaker, indicate that this information shall only be used for the purpose of assisting the registrar of the Supreme Court in carrying out his functions under the Juries Act. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Juries Amendment empowers the Commissioner to use electronic means to impanel a jury. So whilst I imagine we might still have the use of numbered balls being placed in a box and drawn, this also enables the use of computers to use electronic methods to impanel a jury. Those are the amendments that is what these amendments do, Mr. Speaker. I thought it was useful to mention that because one of the previous speakers from the party opposite waxed eloquent about a separate amendment that we had passed last year. And I just wanted members of the public to know that what is before us today is to enable the parliamentary commissioner to collect information, phone number, email, fax number, NIB number, and to share that information with the registrar of the Supreme Court to enable that registrar to use that information to assist in impaneling a jury. Mr. Speaker, these amendments today are linked, and they link two critical functions, in my opinion, of citizens, of responsible, active, engaged citizens. That first responsibility is the responsibility to register and to vote in order to elect the government to administer their affairs, and it involves their responsibility to assist in the administration of justice through jury service. And these are two very, very important and fundamental functions, Mr. Speaker. Through voting, of course, our public officials are elected, and through voting, the public, as we are so often reminded, and of course we accept, can pass judgment on those elected officials through the process of periodic elections, Mr. Speaker, so that when we come to elections, the public will tell us by their actions whether they agree with what we have done and on the adequacy of the level of our service. By voting, Mr. Speaker, citizens get to participate in having the country move in the direction that they would like to see it. They help by their votes, Mr. Speaker, to formulate our national priorities by voting for the parties or the individuals that best reflect their values and where they want to see the country grow. Through jury service, Mr. Speaker, citizens ensure the proper functioning of our judicial systems through our process of jury trials. And we have heard about the difficulties experienced by the system because of the lack of jurors or the unwillingness of citizens to participate in jury trials, Mr. Speaker. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that we can do a couple of things. We can stand in here and use the fact that it is difficult for jurors to be impaneled in some cases and use that to indicate some failure of the present administration. Or we can do that what this administration has done in seeking to widen the pool, hence the amendments last year to allow for jurors to be impaneled from the Family Islands. And we can do what we're doing here today, i.e. allowing the parliamentary commissioner to collect additional information, to make it easier to contact individuals and share that information with the Supreme Court to make it easier to impanel a jury, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through jury service as well, our citizens ensure that by the whole concept of judgment by a jury of one, or trial of a jury of one's peers, national norms and the national sentiment as it relates to the whole concept of justice and crime and punishment are reflected in the outcomes from our court system. Juries have the power to acquit. They set the whole concept of a fair trial, Mr. Speaker, and so they put the onus on the prosecution to ensure that when they do come to court, the evidence, because, Mr. Speaker, the punishments are potentially so severe, they ensure that the cases are of sufficient strength to ensure a conviction. And again, that puts the onus on those who administer justice, Mr. Speaker. And again, we can come in here and talk about who is acquitted and who walks away because of lack of evidence, but, Mr. Speaker, it is proper for the standard to be very, very high when we're talking about depriving people of their freedom. And through jury service, Mr. Speaker, when all citizens become involved through their decisions, they help us to formulate our views and our norms as to what is fair and what is not fair, Mr. Speaker. It is very important, these are short amendments that we're dealing with today, Mr. Speaker, but it is very important that all of our citizens participate and not back off from their civic responsibilities. Nobody is going to do it for us, Mr. Speaker. We have to do it for ourselves. And so I encourage all citizens to embrace these national civic responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. Listening to the contribution so far today, Mr. Speaker, we get two perspectives. We get the perspective of someone speaking from the party opposite, who, as is their norm, offers no solutions or no constructive suggestions, but just seek to criticize and sling mud, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion. And we get another viewpoint, Mr. Speaker, that of the Honorable Member for Tall Pines, who, again, in his impassioned delivery, reflected a lot of what you would hear on the streets, or what you would hear from what we call the proverbial common man, those people who have been victims of crime, etc., who are crying out for a solution, Mr. Speaker. And crime, and particularly violent crime, is, without doubt, a very, very vexing issue, and an issue that occupies the mind of the Bahamian people. No one can say that the level is acceptable, Mr. Speaker. It is totally unacceptable to all of us. Mr. Speaker. But the level, I believe, is a reflection of the development or lack of development or the changes in the attitudes and the norms of what is considered normal behavior among some quarters, Mr. Speaker. And it has taken time. We all can reflect on times when the levels were lower. And now we see, so far this year, 40-odd homicides. Totally unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. There was a time not so long ago when that would have been the national count. But it has taken us some time, and there have been many factors that have gotten us to this point, Mr. Speaker. And it will take us some time to fix these issues. The important thing is, Mr. Speaker, is that you develop a plan and that you seek to execute your plan to attack this problem. We have this question, this age-old question, whether crime is a political issue or is it not, Mr. Speaker. I take the view that inasmuch as the government of the day, the administration of the day, is responsible for the administration of the laws, is responsible for the allocation of the resources to engage in this fight, then to that extent it is a political issue, Mr. Speaker, because as lawmakers, and in particular as government, we are responsible for taking the lead in setting the example and in putting in place initiatives to attack this problem. And it is the easiest thing in the world, Mr. Speaker, and to shoot down and look back and whatever else. But we have to put in place a strategy and put in place resources to combat this crisis of crime. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we have been doing so as an administration, and I will tell you why, Mr. Speaker. Very early in the term of this administration, we restored the security of tenure of the Commissioner of Police to ensure that he or she could perform his or her functions without fear or favor. No more 5-year contract with an option of the government to renew. Mr. Speaker, we thought that was against any sort of form of fairness. It cast a shadow over the office, and it reduced, in our opinion, the faith of the public in the ability, when you have someone who is subject to a contract and renewal, the ability of that person to act without fear or favor. So we restored the security of tenure, Mr. Speaker. Very, very important point. And so when people start to talk and throw accusations around, as some want to do about who is interfering and this and that and all the other things, Mr. Speaker, one of the first acts of this administration was to restore the security of tenure of the Commissioner of Police to ensure that whoever holds that office can do so without fear or without having to sing for any kind of supper, looking for a contract renewal at the end of whatever term it is, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have provided resources to the Royal Bahamas Police Force in terms of men and women and material resources, funds, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that they are adequately equipped to carry out their functions, Mr. Speaker. Equally, we have, or perhaps even more so, we have provided resources to the Royal Bahamas Defense Force in terms of the recruitment of men and women to serve, in terms of unprecedented investment in equipment, in boats, $230-odd million to purchase vessels and to modernize the Coral Harbor base and bases in other parts of the island, Mr. Speaker. Investing resources in the Royal Bahamas Defense Force. We are modernizing the Customs Department, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, I had the opportunity to speak at the graduation of the first 15, or in this dispensation, 15 Customs Marine officers, Mr. Speaker, to assist us in patrolling the marinas, the private marinas, the canals, the harbors, etc., to prevent the smuggling in of guns and ammunition and drugs, etc., Mr. Speaker. We are going to be developing a K-9 unit for the Bahamas Customs Department. So we are investing, putting the Bahamian people's money to work in modernizing the Customs Department to improve our enforcement, Mr. Speaker, investing in training, Mr. Speaker. We have invested in improved conditions at our Simpson Penn and William A. Pratt Center for young men and young women, respectively, Mr. Speaker, to give them a better environment so that they're not seen as being discarded at a young age, but improving the environment of those young persons who have perhaps strayed from the straight and narrow, to give them another chance, Mr. Speaker. We've invested in improved conditions, Mr. Speaker. We've invested billions of dollars in an upgrade of the detention center, Mr. Speaker. We've provided millions of dollars in terms of repatriation to protect the integrity of our borders and deal with the problem of illegal immigration, Mr. Speaker. We've invested in new courts to improve the administration of justice, to speed up trials so we don't have cases being adjourned to 3 years from today, and so that bail is almost automatic, Mr. Speaker. We've invested in the courts so that we can have more trials done, so that trials are not put off for years, and so that this issue of unreasonable delay does not arise, Mr. Speaker. We have amended the Bail Act to make it more difficult for violent offenders to get bail. We have facilitated the appointment of additional justices for the courts that have been constructed, Mr. Speaker. We have invested in prevention programs. Yes, we have invested in Urban Renewal 2.0. We have invested in the Urban Renewal Small Home Repair Program, Mr. Speaker, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes have been repaired to the satisfaction of the owners, Mr. Speaker. We have invested in the Bahamas Technical and Vocational Institute by providing more scholarships so our young people can go to BTVI free of charge and learn a trade, and so they don't fall into a life of crime, Mr. Speaker. We've invested in more scholarships at the College of the Bahamas, more scholarships so our students can study overseas. More funds have been allocated for summer employment, Mr. Speaker, to keep our young people occupied during the summer. More funds invested in social services, Mr. Speaker, to take care of the needs of those who have fallen through the cracks, Mr. Speaker. More money invested in social services so that those who have fallen through the cracks and find themselves in need do not feel that they are abandoned and forgotten by society, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have invested in job training through the development of the National Training Agency.
Members, there's a member on the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have invested in job training through the establishment and providing the resources to the National Training Agency, Mr. Speaker, to provide skills to our young people. Again, to impart skills to them so that they can become employed, they can support themselves, and perhaps assist in supporting their families, and hence not turn to a life of crime, Mr. Speaker. All of these things are related, Mr. Speaker. So when someone can get up and say that the philosophy of this government is do nothing and perhaps people will forget, Mr. Speaker, they're not being totally forthright, Mr. Speaker. This government has, from day one, from the very beginning, taken decisive action to address this problem of crime, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any plan to address the crime problem has to recognize that you have to have a plan that runs the gamut from enforcement and punishment straight to prevention, or the other way around, from prevention straight up to punishment and enforcement. And as I have demonstrated, I believe, Mr. Speaker, and others who speak can expand on it, the government is making tremendous efforts in this area. But what we all recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that there needs to be a change in attitude, particularly attitudes towards conflict resolution and expression. And as much as all of us would like to be able to wake up one morning and flip a switch and the problem is solved, or pull a lever and the problem is solved, Mr. Speaker, we have to recognize that there's no quick fix, Mr. Speaker. What we have to do is focus on being able to punish those hardcore criminals that are wreaking havoc on our society, and we do that by resourcing our law enforcement agencies, by resourcing our courts, Mr. Speaker, and we have to provide positive alternatives for our young people, and we do that by investing in alternatives like the urban renewal, like training, like providing scholarships to BTVI, like improving conditions at our centers for young people, Mr. Speaker. And so, to say that this government has abdicated its responsibility or is doing nothing, Mr. Speaker, is totally false. The evidence does not support this at all. In fact, it supports the exact opposite, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so I just want to say that, and to reaffirm, that with these bills, again, what we are doing is seeking to empower our officials, give them more resources, more tools to do their jobs. In this case, making more information available to our registrar of the Supreme Court so that they can impanel jurors who will sit on the cases. We can invest in the courts, we can invest in police officers, we can do all of these things, but if at one of those links in that chain, if we've done all of that and we cannot impanel jurors, then the whole thing is for naught, Mr. Speaker. And so we have to be able to come here and do these things that will incrementally equip our public officials to do the jobs that they are set to do, Mr. Speaker. And by bringing these two bills together, I think symbolically, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Elections Bill and the Jury Amendment Bill, it affirms, at least in my mind, Mr. Speaker, it caused me to reflect back on our roles as citizens of our country and our joint responsibility, all of us, individually, by our actions, by doing our civic duty to not, of course, at the end of the day, the buck stops over here because the administration of the government is responsible, but it reaffirms our several responsibility as citizens, Mr. Speaker, to each of us do every day all that is necessary to create a society, a kind of society in which we want to live. Mr. Speaker, I support the amendments to the two bills.